familiar with author Peter Schweizer. He's written a number of explosive books shining the light on how our elected officials in Washington are able to gain not just power, but extreme wealth once they're in office. Peter, you have a new book, Profiles in Corruption, Abuse of Power by America's Progressive Elites. To be clear, we're talking about most, not all of the Democratic candidates that happen to be running for the presidency right now.
Yeah, the defining feature is I decided to look at progressives, and the reason is I've gone after people on both sides of the party in the past, but I feel like we're kind of operating in what I call the Trump vortex, which is there's such a singular focus on Trump that it kind of blots out coverage of everybody else. Don't get me wrong, the president needs to have scrutiny. He's the most powerful man in the world, but I think those that are either aspiring to his job or are shaping our policy need that attention as well. So I decided to kind of follow the money, as it were, as it relates to these other individuals, and I think I found some pretty shocking things.
Yeah, I'm going to let you elaborate on that a little bit. What was the most jaw-dropping thing, and I don't want you to give away the book, but what was the most interesting thing during your research that you uncovered?
Well, as it relates to a couple of people, it's quite interesting. One was Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is kind of, seen as the voice crying in the wilderness, the heart and soul of the progressive movement, the guy who kind of lives the way progressives say that people should live. But the reality is I found that really over the course of 30 years, beginning when he was mayor of Burlington, Vermont, when he was in Congress, later when he was in the U.S. Senate, he has steered lots of money to his family, sometimes stacked taxpayer money, sometimes campaign money. So his family's become quite wealthy through his public service. That was a surprise to me. And then as it relates to Joe Biden, people are very familiar probably with the whole Ukraine issue, the fact that his son got this sweetheart deal in Ukraine. That was something that I exposed first in my previous book. But in this book, I show what I call the Biden Five, and that is the 5 members of the Biden family who cashed in during his vice presidency, Hunter Biden being one, but the other 4 members of his family as well, who did very, very well when he had his reins on national power.
You know, Peter, when people listen to the Democratic candidates, many of them sit up there and they try to really reach out to their supporters by saying, hey, I'm just like you. I'm just a regular guy. But what you're telling us is, in many ways, they're no different than Donald Trump. These are fat cats. They have a lot of money, and they have apparently profited from the system that they're in.
Yeah, I generally have a rule, which is regardless of what side of the aisle they're on, the vast majority of politicians are not like the average person for a lot of reasons. And that certainly goes with this slate of candidates. They may not have the wealth of the president, although, of course, Mayor Michael Bloomberg has even more than the president. But I think the key defining issue for a lot of people is how do they make their money? I think a lot of people don't fault Michael Bloomberg or Donald Trump for making money in the private sector. It's really, have they used their public office? Are they using public service to service themselves and their family rather than the public? That's what really frustrates and angers people. And what you find is a lot of these individuals have done precisely that. And that, I think, demands scrutiny because people, I think, by and large, don't mind people becoming wealthy, but if they're getting wealthy by abusing or using their office in a way to do so, that's where people draw the line, whether they're Republicans or Democrats.
And Peter, the system is built so that they can actually profit without breaking the law, for instance, if they want to buy or trade stocks, correct?
That's exactly right. The focus in this book is on corruption. Corruption does not have to be illegal. In fact, there's a saying in Washington, D.C. that the real criminal stuff that goes on in Washington, D.C. is the stuff they do that's legal, that the laws don't actually apply to. And I think that's part of the problem. If the defense of a political figure is, well, I might have done this, I might have, traded on the stock market with information from government, but I didn't technically break the law. If that's their only defense, I think that's a pretty poor defense. My point by and large is that no political person is irreplaceable. There are plenty of good people that can come up and take those positions from other people. So if a politician tries to convince you they're irreplaceable when they're facing charges of self-enrichment or corruption, I'm very, very skeptical and would encourage people to run the other way.
Why is it still, the system has not been changed? Why is it still in place where a lot of these things can exist? They can benefit, they can go into office literally with pennies in their bank account and come out millionaires. Why hasn't that been addressed?
It's a great question. The bottom line is because the people that are engaging in this self-enriching behavior are the same people that get to write their own rules. You know, who doesn't want that kind of an arrangement? The problem is they're not going to turn off the water spigot. They're not going to eliminate opportunities to enrich themselves and their families unless they absolutely have to. If they feel like it's going to cost them their job, they will reluctantly make the steps and the reforms that are necessary. But until they're at that point, they're not going to do that. And that generally goes for Republicans and Democrats as well. We have what I often call a permanent political class in Washington, D.C. that's very comfortable, that's been there for a while, that enjoys the perks of office. They come into office generally not worth very much. They leave 20 years later and they're suddenly worth, you know, sometimes tens of millions of dollars. And that comes through public service. And that system's not going to change because they don't want it to change unless they feel like they absolutely have to because voters are pressuring them to do so.
So in some ways, winning that office is almost like winning the lottery. What can voters do as they head to the polls this November? How can they know that the candidate they're voting for is one of those people who has no ethical issues there when it comes to profiting from their position?
Well, that's a great question. Look, all the office holders have to file financial disclosures, so you can see what kind of money they have, and that will give you evidence of where they got the money. But I would also look at their family members. There's a lot of information out there about some of the schemes that political figures get involved in. People don't always take advantage of that information. So the first thing I would say is be aware, get the information. But the second part, and I think this is critically important, is I tell people you have to be prepared to call out your own side. You know, whether you're an ardent conservative or you know, a committed liberal, if you're only calling out the other side, if you're only interested in the scandal or the controversy or the self-enrichment on one side and not your own side, we're not going to get anywhere. You have to be prepared to call out your own side if they're engaging in these behaviors that self-enrich. You have to hold them into account. And again, recognize, I would encourage everybody, nobody is irreplaceable. All these political figures that are engaging in corrupt actions and behaviors can be replaced. You can find somebody that shares your same views to replace them. And only by having a zero-tolerance policy for people on your own side are we going to effectively deal with this.
All right, Peter Schweizer, we're going to leave it there. Peter Schweizer's new book, Profiles in Corruption, Abuse of Power by America's Progressive Elite, available in bookstores and online. Thank you, Peter.